take deeply your responsibility to maintain our system of
Thank you,
government
Mr.
and our
Strzok.
institutions.
I just need to say in closing, if anybody should be pissed at the FBI because you all helped this unfit man become president of the United States by not revealing to the people that he was under investigation in his campaign, it should be me. They should be applauding you, kissing you, and giving you all awards. Because but for you, we would have had a legitimate president elected. I yield back my time.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for unanimous consent.
Mr. Chairman, as you are aware, under House rules, minority members have the right to demand a day of hearings to allow witnesses to testify on the subject of today's hearing. As you also know, during the course of today's hearing, the majority opposed Representative Swalwell's motion to subpoena Steve Bannon for testimony. On behalf of the minority members of both the Judiciary and Government Reform Committees, I am delivering a letter to Chairman Goodlatte and Chairman Gowdy, formally invoking our right to call a minority day of hearings so that Steve Bannon may testify, and I ask unanimous consent to insert a copy of that letter into the hearing record.
Without objection. The
Thank
gentleman
you.
from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Strzok, I appreciate you being here. Thank you, and I will assure you I take this very seriously. But also, I want to, as you go in and look in, there's been a lot of talks about text. There's been a lot of talk about your bias, non-bias, your opinions, and your willingness to elaborate on that. I have some questions that will not require you to have to be elaborate or anything. They're going to be simple, straightforward questions, because as I've been looking through this and also talking to the current FBI director, the current deputy attorney general, and reading through some things have popped up that I think at least need some clarification. When was the last time you were subject to a polygraph?
Approximately 2 or 3 years ago.
2 or 3 years ago. To your knowledge, have you ever failed a polygraph or found to be out of scope?
I've never failed one. I was out of scope prior to my last polygraph.
And that would have been at what time? You said 2 to 3 years ago. Could you be more specific?
Sir, I think we can cut to the chase. I think there's an email that talks about people being out of scope for a polygraph, which generated my last polygraph.
Oh, don't worry. We're going to be cut to the chase.
Sir, it's
so
your
January.
time,
so you want to go ahead and say it's January 2016 when you received a text or an email, correct?
Sir, if that's the date, I'll stipulate to that. I don't have those dates.
Okay, we'll take that as a stipulation. Has an examiner ever accused you of attempting to use countermeasures during a polygraph examination?
Not to my recollection, no.
You received your email in January, as you've stated, and you've stipulated to. Your polygraph was out of scope in January 2016. To your knowledge, how long was your polygraph out of scope?
Sir, I don't know. I recall it's the penultimate, the second to last polygraph I had was when I was a supervisor at Washington Field Office, which would have occurred somewhere between 2008 and 2011. My understanding of what out of scope means for the FBI is that polygraphs have a kind of 5-year span of effectiveness or validity. We had several people we were trying to, including me, trying to get read into a particular intelligence compartment. They ran the names. Me and some others were out of scope, which happens because polygraphs are, the line for polygraphs is longer than the normal.
I understand. I'm a member of the military, Mr. Strzok. I understand the lines for polygraph. I understand the delays in them. However, you happen to have a very secure job and a very one that is highly sensitive. Yep. So the question is, again, I would assume to answer your evasiveness, you did not know how long you were out of scope. Is that correct? Yes or no?
That's fair, sir. I was trying to recreate it by recollection, but
So yes or no, do you know how long you were out of scope?
I do not.
Okay. What steps were taken to bring you into scope?
I went and had a polygraph.
Okay, was this after the January 16 letter that you received?
It would have been afterwards, yes, sir.
Okay. If you were out of scope, when was the last time you accessed classified information?
Night before last, preparing for this.
Okay. You currently have what classification?
I have a top secret clearance with some SCI compartments.
Okay. During the time that you were out of scope, did you have access to SCI?
Yes, sir.
Are you aware that it is FBI procedure that a failure or out-of-scope polygraph does not terminate a top secret, but however, a failure of this would require you to be read out of SCI access, although you could maintain your top secret? This was a direct answer from a question that I posed and was received within the last week. Were you aware that you should have been read out of any SCI information
Sure, I
when
believe
you're out of scope?
I believe you used the word failure, which implies, in my mind, a failed poly. I am not and was not aware of the fact that an out-of-scope polygraph required a readout of SCI.
Then the question, then I accept that, Mr. Strzok, but I want to get back to the question. The answer came back from the FBI and Justice itself that is the procedure. So the next question I have is, after the 2618, you did your polygraph at what time? You said you were out of scope, you were brought in by giving a polygraph. When would that have been?
Again, sir, my recollection is the 2016 timeframe, but after that email, but I don't know when, within a month or two, I think.
Are you also aware in the publicly stated version of the IG report that there has been some serious questions and issues concerning polygraph information and lack of polygraph procedures at the Department of Justice and FBI that was brought out by the Inspector General?
I'm generally aware that there was a report, but I'm not aware of the conclusions.
One of the general concerns on this is that when you're out of scope, and this is the answer coming back from the Department of Justice, you should have been read out of SCI. My concern is that during this time frame, you were involved in two very high-profile, what would have been, or at least getting ready for SCI information in which you were not read out of. This is a concern. There's nothing else from that question. I have no further questions, and I am finished, and I yield back.
I think you misstated the conclusion there, sir. I think you said that if in the event of a failure, it would require a readout, and that's not what you concluded.
The gentleman from Georgia controls the time.
Mr. Strzok,
the time's over. Mr. Chairman, the time's up.
May I respond, sir?
There was no question to respond to. The answer is from the Department of Justice. I read you the answer.
May I comment to what I believe is a misstatement?
Briefly.
Georgia. Sir, from your answer, what I took that to be is in the event of a failure, an individual should be read out. You are conflating that with a out of scope or failure. It is not my understanding that out of scope requires somebody to be read out. It may be. I'm not a security professional, but you appear to...
So you're out of sync right now with an answer that was received from the Department of Justice, and that is an interesting answer that you just gave, that you may have been out of sync, and the question now becomes, is policies and procedures failed or not failed? This is a serious investigation, which I do take seriously, and if you would have been read out, you should have been read out. That is my final answer statement, not a question, not opposed. I yield back.
The gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline, is recognized for 5 minutes.
And Mr. Chairman, I look forward to a couple of extra minutes as each of my Republican colleagues have had. Mr. Strzok, serving on this committee and representing the state of Rhode Island has been one of the greatest honors of my life. But the conduct of this committee today has been, for me, tremendously sad, embarrassing, and really dangerous to our democracy. And I want to apologize to you for the way you've been treated by this committee. And for the American people who are watching, you ought not wonder why they've lost confidence in Congress and are sick of the kind of circus that they saw being conducted in this room today. Because rather than focusing on urgent issues like family separation, reasonable efforts to reduce gun violence in our communities, considering legislation to reform our broken immigration system, passing legislation to reduce the cost of prescription drugs, addressing the inability of Americans who fall behind in their student loans to discharge that debt in bankruptcy, or oversight of the many conflicts of interest and corruption in this administration, we're having yet another hearing on the Hillary Clinton emails. What you should understand, Mr. Strzok, is the reason my Republican colleagues will not let you answer a question is because they're not interested in your answers. This is about promoting a narrative. You're a prop. So they can promote a narrative in an ongoing effort to distract from the serious investigation of the special counsel that is closing in on the Trump inner circle. This is a campaign to undermine that work. And sadly, they'll do whatever is necessary to do it in concert with the president. Attack the FBI, attack the Department of Justice, undermine the rule of law. And so your emails are a perfect foil for this effort. They're not interested in hearing your context and your explanation because it's not about you. It's about protecting the president. My colleagues have acted more like they're on the defense team for Donald Trump than exercising their very serious oversight responsibilities as members of these two committees. You know, Robert Mueller was praised to the heavens by everyone, Republican and Democratic alike, when he was appointed. Now he's a villain. What's the only thing that's changed? 19 indictments, 5 guilty pleas, and the circle's closing in. So I accept your sworn testimony about the difference between bias and the actions you took. We don't have to take your word for it alone, although I do. The IG report of 500 pages, interviews, review of documents, comes to the same conclusions. We find the decisions made were consistent with the analytic approach described above. We found that these specific decisions were the result of discretionary judgments made during the course of an investigation by the media agents and prosecutors, and that these judgments were reasonable. So there's a big analysis that was done. Lots of interviews, 500 pages. That's the same conclusion, the same representation you've made today. But don't be frustrated, because they're not interested in that. This is about promoting a narrative. So we know, of course, Mr. Strzok, that the president, the intelligence communities unequivocally conclude that Russia interfered in our elections, that it was directed by Vladimir Putin and for the purposes of helping Donald Trump and hurting Hillary Clinton. Isn't that correct?
Yes, sir.
Do you have any reason to doubt the assessment of our intelligence agencies that may be made with high confidence?
No, sir.
And thereafter, the Senate Intelligence Committee, in a bipartisan way, a Republican-led committee, came to the same conclusion. Isn't that right?
Yes, sir.
And yet the President of the United States and members of the administration continue to deny that the Russian government interfered in our elections. In fact, just as recently as June 28th, the President said, Russia continues to say they had nothing to do with meddling in our elections.
Yes, sir.
And even Secretary Nielsen said, I do not believe that I've seen that conclusion, that the specific intent was to help President Trump win.
I don't recall hearing that.
Okay.
But
And in addition to that, you know about a Trump Tower meeting where there was a discussion between members of the Trump campaign and Russian operatives, correct?
I am aware of that.
And the president then...
Sir, I would not characterize it one way or the other as Russian operatives or not, but I'm aware of them.
Okay. And in that meeting, there was a discussion about some dirt that the Russians had on Hillary Clinton, correct?
Media reporting has indicated that.
And the president then issued a statement in which he lied about that meeting and said it was about an adoption discussion. Correct?
Those statements have been made. Again, I'm relying on what's been reported in the media, not FBI or special counsel.
So would you tell me, Mr. Strzok, in the time that I have remaining, what should we conclude? What raises eyebrows for you about members of a presidential campaign meeting with a foreign adversary of the United States to talk about dirt from about their opponent and then lying about the nature of that meeting? Why should that concern the American people?
Sir, I don't want to comment on any specific fact pattern or anything that relates to an ongoing investigation. So I hesitate, and I don't want to do that in this context.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to note for the record, we've had 0 hearings on Russian interference in the American presidential election, 0 hearings in this committee about our efforts to secure our democracy and secure the elections coming up in November. We've had hundreds of hours devoted to Hillary Clinton's email. This committee has failed in its responsibilities to secure our elections, which is a responsibility we have to the American people. And then when we finally have an opportunity to raise the issue, instead we're going to talk about Hillary Clinton's email. Shame on all of you.
Time of the gentleman
History
has
is going to judge
expired.
you very harshly for this behavior.
Chair
With that,
recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. DeSantis, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Strzok, you've defended your actions, said that you did not evince bias, that your actions weren't motivated by bias, but the Inspector General disagreed. When he asked you about the insurance policy text, the will stop it text, you provided an explanation similar that you did today, and he found your explanation to be unpersuasive, and you're aware of that, correct?
I'm not aware of that with regard to that text.
Well, he did. He testified when we had him in here in June in response to my questioning. He also said that your explanation for how you handled the Anthony Weiner laptop, you delayed, you didn't take action initially. He said your explanation for that, and he did note that in the report, was not persuasive. You're aware of that, correct?
Sir, I'm aware of facts rebutting that he has rebutting that specific assertion.
Well, he testified to us that he was not persuaded by your explanation for why you focused on the Trump-Russia collusion and you let the Weiner thing sit. And then he testified in front of our committee that it was reasonable to infer that your actions involving Weiner's laptop, the fact that you didn't pursue that aggressively, that it is reasonable to infer that it was because of the bias that you evinced in those text messages. Are you aware of his testimony with that?
Not specific to that, but I'll accept your representation.
Yes, and I think it's important to show while the IG report said the Clinton charging decision was not necessarily due to bias, He said that the wiener is absolutely a fair game to infer that, and then they're obviously continuing to investigate the genesis of this Russia interference case. Do you also know that Rod Rosenstein on June 28th, when he testified in front of this committee, he said you were biased? Are you aware of that?
I'm
in
not
response
aware of that.
to my questions? Yes, he did. And he also says that the bias that you evince, it does undermine the integrity of your investigative actions, and it causes the American people to lose confidence in the institution. Do you know he said that?
I don't, and he's...
Well, he did. So the idea that there's no bias here is not, I don't think your explanations have been credible, and I think that if you acted so appropriately, Mueller removed you from the team. You're now at Human Resources, which is obviously a demotion. And then you are now one of the subjects of an ongoing IG investigation, correct?
No, sir.
Your conduct is not being reviewed by Horowitz about what you did or did not do in the Russia collusion case?
I'm unaware of being a subject of any ongoing IG.
Well, I bet you your conduct is at issue there. Let me ask you this. You opened up the counterintelligence investigation on 31 July. Was that because of the George Papadopoulos information?
Sir, I can't get into the guidance that the FBI has provided me about answers I can provide. That gets into a level of detail that I can't, that I've been directed not to provide.
You have answered some questions. I mean, I think this has been a little bit of convenience. I mean, you've answered some questions about there was grave concerns and all this stuff about why you were doing it. You didn't do that. The dossier, was the dossier a part of why you opened up the investigation?
No, but sir, none of this has been convenience. All of this has been based on what the department has worked out with Chairman Goodlatte about what is permitted and not. This is not a function of
convenience. So the dossier was not part of it. That's important. When did you learn the dossier was funded by Hillary Clinton and the Democratic Party?
I don't think that's an accurate representation, and the department or the FBI has directed me not to answer that question based on ongoing investigations.
Right. So Hillary, DNC sent to Perkins Coie, who sent to Fusion, who paid, I mean, come on.
Again,
it was a political document, correct?
The latter's close. I cannot comment. The FBI has directed me to not answer that question.
Would it be fair to say that the dossier what would you choose? Is it a political document, opposition research, or is it legitimate intelligence?
Sir, I would very much like to answer that question.
Okay.
I've been directed by the FBI that I may not get into that based on operational requirements or equities.
So here's the issue I think we have. We see the bias that you did. Your explanations for why you said what you did, really aren't credible. We're trying to get to the genesis of why open up a counterintelligence investigation against the opposing party's campaign. I'm with you about focusing on Russia and holding them accountable, but you tried to rope in the other party's nominee. There was also a lot of bias, and then we can't get any answers to the questions of what the genesis of any of this was. And let me finish. May 18th, Chairman Gowdy mentioned, you say, look, my concern's that there's no big there. So this had been going on for at least 10 months. I think it was going on before July 31st. And there you are, Mueller's appointed, and you can't even identify any reason to suspect that there was collusion between Trump's campaign and Russia. There was no big there after 10 months. So that's the concern, is that somebody like you, who said we'll stop him, who said we needed insurance policy, that you let that bias, you wanted there to be something there. You wanted it to be true, and that, I think, influence your actions. You can prove us wrong by providing us the information. I'd like the information on any type of informants pre-July 31st. I'd like the information on what you used to open up the counterintelligence investigation. I want to know whether that was any foreign intelligence involved or whether it was funneled through the State Department. These are all questions that if we just put those out and answer them, then a lot of us would be able to then make I think, American people can make a judgment. I'm going over my time. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Briefly.
Sir, two things. You asked why I couldn't explain why a case would be open. I don't think that's accurate. If you look at Director Comey's statement when the Department of Justice had authorized him to say that the FBI had opened a case into allegations that the government of Russia had made an offer of assistance in the potential involvement of members of the Trump campaign. I cannot envision a scenario where that would not be a reasonable predication to open an investigation.
Well, if it's Papadopoulos,
credible-
that's not quite
if
what
they're
what they had.
credible,
I mean,
sure, I
you
think
didn't
the
quite
character-
get there.
I
I know
think the
Comey may have said that, but you didn't quite get there. So if
I
it's
think the
Papadopoulos, that's weak.
I think the characterization was that it was a credible source of information, stands on its own. I don't think anybody in this committee would argue that, one, it wasn't appropriate to open that, and two, that it wasn't absolutely
We
fully
have
predicated
questions
and
about
appropriate.
whether it was appropriate because we don't know the underlying information.
And,
we
sir, I
read in
think
the New
that's-
York Times from leaks that it was because Papadopoulos said at a bar.
The time of
that
the
there was
gentleman
this going
has
on.
expired.
I want
I'm
to know if that's the
I'm
reason.
trying
why.
to respond.
Regular
to that.
order.
And-
Regular order.
and
The
so,
chair
sir, I
recognizes
think
the
there's absolutely-
gentleman.
Mr. Chairman, there's a second element of a question the gentleman.
Very, no.
You raised the question about whether or not I agreed with the Inspector General that I had acted in any way that was biased.
You
on the answer.
had an opportunity to answer that earlier.
Sir, I did not.
So,
To this
the gentleman from
congressman, I did not.
Illinois, Mr. Krishnamurthy, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Strzok. Mr. Strzok, on July 3rd, your lawyer, Mr. Goldman, made the following statement to Chris Cuomo on CNN regarding you, his client. On Fox News, they talk about him as the center of this anti-Trump cabal that was determined to throw the election against Trump. None of this has a shred of truth. Do you agree with this statement, sir?
I do.
And in a June 19th op-ed in USA Today, your lawyer said regarding the Russia investigation, what we call the Russia collusion investigation, that you and your team, quote unquote, went out of their way to prevent leaks and actively ensured that news reports did not overplay the seriousness of the investigation. Is that true, sir?
Yes.
Now tell us why it's so important to prevent leaks from the FBI to journalists or to others.
Leaks are terrible. They undercut things in a variety of ways. They can upend investigations. They can lead to incorrect assumptions. They can let witnesses, subjects know that they're being investigated. They can lead to wild speculation, destruction of evidence, any number of really bad, disclosure of classified information, any number of really bad adverse things.
Got it. The DOJ IG's report has this to say about your involvement in the decision to inform Congress about the Wiener laptop. Quote unquote, Strzok explained that the decision to seek a search warrant for the Wiener laptop was known to many people beyond the mid-year team, and this raised a concern that this information could leak. Is this statement from the IG's report true?
Yes.
Now, could you unpack that for us a little bit? First of all, you said, according to the IG's report, that the search warrant for the Wiener laptop was known to many people beyond the mid-year team. Could you explain whether any of those people would be in the New York field office?
So my recollection is that the investigation of the crimes against children case of Mr. Wiener was handled out of the New York field office by the Southern District of New York, or maybe the Eastern District. I think it was SDNY.
And so the people to whom you're referring included people in the New York field office, correct?
That's correct.
And you had concerns about their actions if Director Comey did not inform Congress about this Wiener laptop.
I did not have concerns about New York. My concerns were just general, that the more people who are aware of something, the greater chance that it leaks out somehow. But those concerns were not specific in my mind to New York.
Okay. Let me ask you about this. In a report, in that same report, Attorney General Loretta Lynch recalls a conversation with then Director Comey in the final days of the 2016 election. Quote unquote, he, referring to Comey, said, "It's clear to me that there's a cadre of senior people in New York who have a deep and visceral hatred of Secretary Clinton." And he said it is, quote unquote, deep. Were you aware of this concern?
I was aware of certainly some of the press reporting and some people expressing that concern, yes.
Was one of those people Director Comey?
A person having that concern?
Yes.
Yes.
Could you explain to me a little bit about that and how that, in your view, affected the revelation of the warrant for Wiener's laptop?
You'd have to ask Director Comey that. I think there was discussion, I remember, and particularly some of it was in the context of reporting from Mr. Giuliani and others talking about connections to New York. But again, I don't want to scapegoat New York because a lot of people were aware of it, and there were concerns just about the number of folks, but with regard to Mr. Comey, my recollection is that he was aware of those concerns, but I was not privy to discussions he had with the Attorney General or other concerns he might have had outside of my presence or conversation.
Now, with regard to Mr. Giuliani, on October 25th, then Trump campaign advisor Rudy Giuliani promised a quote-unquote pretty big surprise coming up in the campaign. On October 28th, Giuliani claimed to be in contact with former agents and a quote-unquote few active agents who obviously don't want to identify themselves. Let me make sure I have this right. There was a concern that there is a deep and visceral hatred towards Secretary Clinton in the New York field office. At the same time, Mr. Giuliani says that he's having contacts with agents, active agents. Can you give us your take on this and your comments on this particular issue?
I recall that comment. I recall it caused me a lot of concern.
And why? Why did it cause you concern?
Because while it's certainly possible that Mr. Giuliani is exaggerating or engaging in some sort of puffery, the reality is that also given the things that were going on, given the timing that the laptop was there and he was talking about that in the context of a big surprise, it caused me great concern that he had information about that.
In other words,
should not have had.
That he should not have had.
Correct.
Through a leak?
Through an unauthorized disclosure, sure, leak, yes.
Thank you, sir.
The members are advised that there are votes on the floor of the House. How many? 4 votes. So, Mr. Strzok, you probably have a good 45 minutes to